So thank you for having me, and I apologize I wasn't here for the entire session up till now. I had a conflict, but I did catch the end of Ben's talk, and I think you'll see some interesting connections. I particularly like the sentence in there about AI being a new form of intelligence that we just have to study with the same tools of neuroscience that we have developed so far. Okay, so the talk that I want to give you about is about this phenomena that animals build what are known as cognitive maps or mental maps. So there's decades of work that concluded that it's called the cognitive map hypothesis, that the brain in organisms builds an internal spatial representation of the environment of the organism. And this got kicked off from Edward Tolman's 1948 paper, where he was conducting experiments on rats in mazes. And this is considered one of the classics in the history of psychology. I encourage you, it's online. I encourage you to try and, go through it. It's also written in a very different format in the kinds of papers that we write today. It's an interesting read. And what Tolman did is he trained rats in mazes, the mazes shown below on the screen, to go and find food. So the rats are, let me see, I assume people can see my mouse pointer. So the rats are released at point A, the food is located at point G, and they have to traverse this path, a corridor, to find it. Rats get good at this task, and after that they are introduced into a modified version of the maze where the pathway that they're used to taking is now blocked, and there are multiple options that they could pursue of multiple tunnels that exist now. And the fascinating thing is that if you look at the distribution of what rats actually end up doing, they end up going 6. Yeah, 6 is where the peak of that distribution happens, which is pointing roughly towards where that food was located. And this Tolman used to argue that these rats are not just memorizing the pathway that they had discovered leads to reward, that they are building an internal spatial representation. He called it a cognitive map of the environment. And since then, this sort of has kicked off an entire sort of decades of work. We now believe ants construct cognitive maps, bats construct cognitive maps, chimpanzees construct cognitive maps, blind mole rats construct cognitive maps. There's a fascinating experiment with chimpanzees in particular, where a human experimenter will carry a chimpanzee and walk them through a particular pathway. So the numbers on the screen, 1, 2, 3, 4, are the order in which the human walked the chimpanzee through a particular sequence of steps. And then after that, the chimpanzee was released at the start location. The chimpanzee does not traverse the same order. It goes in the arrows shown here below, which again was used to argue and indicate that there is a spatial representation and not a memorization of the pathway that was demonstrated. And ultimately, the discoveries on how the brain does this with hippocampus and the existence of place cells and grid cells led to a Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine in 2014. So animals build maps, and we know from decades of work in robotics that machines use maps. If you want to train a machine or a robot, if you want to build a robot to do navigation, it has a spatial data structure, typically conducted through LiDAR and studied in the field of SLAM. Modern sort of neural networks have also been used for this. In this work, what we asked was, this is a paper appearing at iClear this year. It is also, we were very fortunate that this got selected as the outstanding paper at iClear. We asked the following question, which is, do AI agents learn to build maps in the course of learning to navigate? So if we don't already feed them with maps, we don't build a mapping module, is mapping an emergent phenomena? Is that what just happens if you want to navigate? Why would you care about that question? Why does it matter? Well, for one, it would give us insight into explaining the curious phenomena. There's a modern curious phenomena of what are known as pixels to actions or sensors to actions neural networks. where you just take your input observations, feed them into a neural network, and just predict actions. There is no explicit mapping module. And that line of work and those methods are working very well at certain navigation tasks in certain domains. And so we don't know why do these methods work. If we find evidence of emergence of mapping, that would explain some of these results. And the second sort of deeper thing is about the phenomena of convergent evolution. So in biological evolution, convergent evolution is the idea of unrelated organisms evolving structures that have the same function. So the structure of wings. So it turns out that three completely different kinds of organisms fly. Birds fly. Pterosaurs, which are kind of dinosaurs, they flew. Three different kinds of organisms fly. Bats fly, dinosaurs, a certain kind of dinosaurs flew, and birds fly. And this is even ignoring insects, for example, that also fly. Their common ancestor did not fly. The existence of wings and flight has evolved in completely parallel chains of species. And the fact that they all developed wing-like structures is pointing to the underlying pressures of the ecological niche and the problem that they were trying to solve. Wings are just one example, but poison, echolocation, antennas, streamlined shapes, photosynthesis, eyes, for example, the eyes in cephalopods like octopus and squids have evolved completely independently from human or mammalian eyes. Octopi, for example, don't have a blind spot because their optic nerve passes behind the screen. Those are all examples of convergent evolution. And what they are pointing to is that there is an underlying intelligence problem that needs to be solved. And if maps are an emergent phenomena, if AI organisms also develop mapping as an emergent phenomena, then maps are a natural solution to navigation. Whether the agent is artificial or biological doesn't matter. And so we'd be able to make a claim about the underlying intelligent problem that needs to be solved and the solution that nature and AI comes up with. Okay, so the task that we're going to use to ask this question is a task called point goal navigation. The task is as follows. There is an agent that is spawned in a 3D environment, like the scan of a real world house or a building or an apartment complex or something else, what have you. It is asked to go to delta X, delta Y, delta Z, if you will. There's a relative coordinate. It is spawned randomly. That establishes an episodic coordinate system. It is asked to go to a relative coordinate. The map being shown on the right is only for visualization. The agent does not have the map. If the map was provided, this is a trivial path planning problem. It is an intro to computer science path planning problem. The map is not provided. It's an open research question. The agent has an egocentric depth observation, a depth sensor, an egocentric RGB sensor, and it can keep track of where the goal is because it has an ego motion sensor, often called GPS and compass in this literature. And this is what an episode in the life of this agent might look like. It's navigating, goes to the target. And the goal specification here has incidentally some biological plausibility. So it turns out bees conduct this waggle dance when bees discover nectar. They will come back to their hive and they will do a particular dance, and the direction of the dance and the number of vibrations that they conduct, it communicates r comma theta. So it's the same point goal coordinate that is being conducted. The key sort of problem in trying to say, do agents build maps, is that how can we be sure that the agent uses its map, particularly since there are many ways of doing navigation. So in biological organisms, we know that organisms can navigate through visual cues and landmarks. You don't build a map, you just recognize where you are. So imagine you don't know how to get to a mall, but once you're there, you can see the mall. So you know you're there and you've remembered certain intermediate points. Biological organisms use magnetic fields, solar flares, chemical navigation. There's all sorts of ways of doing navigation in biological systems. And so we are going to take a fairly extreme point, because these are artificial organisms, we can control their sensory suite. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give them only ego motion, or only the ability to tell how far they are moving as they are taking actions. And so this is what an episode or a day in the life of our blind agent looks like. It just knows how it's moving along, where it is in its episodic coordinate system, and where the goal is. That's it. So this is, it has no other sensory mechanism other than that. And what we're going to do is we're going to construct essentially model-free. We're not going to assume anything about navigation or 3D. We're not going to put our thumb on the scale. We're not going to already bake in the idea of mapping in there, because we're asking the question whether mapping emerges, so we can't take a stand and bake that in. So what we're going to do is, if there was an image, there isn't. If there was an image, we would, and a relative distance, relative location sensor, the image would have been embedded in a CNN. The relative location is through some linear layers embedded into a feature space. And we would just feed that into a LSTM or a GRU policy that has an internal recurrent state and is producing certain actions like turn left, turn right, move forward. These are discrete actions, and a value function estimate. Since we do not, our agents are blind, we just don't even have the visual pathway. There is just a relative distance encoding at every time step that is fed into an LSTM. Why an LSTM? Why not context window transformer? Largely historical reasons. We started this project at a point of time where the field was dominated by LSTMs, but I don't think that is the sort of primary thing to focus on here. Although all our results are conditioned on it being an LSTM. Okay, so first of all, notice there's only ego motion sensing, so there cannot be other mechanisms to explain navigation. You cannot talk about recognizing landmarks. There is no inductive bias towards mapping. There's no mapping module. There's no mapping supervision. It's a generic architecture consisting of LSTMs and fully connected layers. So there's no sort of spatial architecture. There's no spatial memory. There's no auxiliary tasks. It is just going to be on policy episodic reinforcement learning. There's no expert demonstrations, no imitation learning, no replay buffers, nothing. Just you act, and the only thing it's going to be is dense rewards. If you reach your goal, you get some positive reward S. Along the way, you get reward, which is, are you making progress towards the goal? Is the distance to the goal at time t lower than the distance to the goal at time t minus 1? If yes, great, you get some positive reward. If not, you get some negative reward. And just existing in the world has some penalty. And so there's an impetus to be efficient. That is all there is. And this, by the way, this distance computation is where any notion of this being a spatial problem comes in. Before this, there's actually not even any spatial understanding. The problem is essentially agnostic to that. Okay, so the first question, can blind agents navigate? Turns out the answer is a resounding yes. So here's a plot where on the x-axis are steps of experience, how many actions have they been trained under, and on the y-axis is performance. So this is performance on new environments and new episodes. So the first thing that you almost immediately notice is that sighted versus blind agents, their success rates are very similar. Both sighted and blind agents will get to the target. What is not very similar is something known as SPL. I won't go into the detail of what SPL is, but it's essentially a metric of efficiency, of path efficiency. Sighted agents, the dashed line, the dashed gray line, they are fairly efficient. They take efficient paths, and blind agents take inefficient paths. But if you just measure success, they're both pretty close. This is, for example, what that looks like. This is a sighted agent going from the blue dot to the red square. It is taking essentially what looks like the shortest path in this space. This is a sighted agent. And this is what a blind agent does. It essentially slams its face into a wall, and it follows the wall along. So it is following the wall below. At some point, it is not making progress. It backtracks. It will not get stuck in a loop, so it will actually overshoot the previous stopping point and then make its way to the goal. And again, the only sensory mechanism this thing has is relative location. Am I making with respect to the last action I took, how far did I move? Here's another episode where this is a sighted agent again. Notice it goes through corridors, doorways, doesn't slam into any of the walls. And this is a blind agent that, let's see, yeah, this is a blind agent that will again follow obstacles, walls, sides of bed. It'll go down a particular pathway, realize it's blocked, backtrack, make its way to the next hallway, and so on. And it'll continue this process. Okay. So the first finding is that blind agents can navigate. And actually, there is emergence of something known as the bug algorithm. So in the 1980s, roboticists and like computational planning folks came up with, essentially asked this question: if I have a point mass agent with polygonal obstacles in a 2D environment, with the only sensing being is the point mass in contact with something? Can I make sure that I reach from any point to any other point? And the answer, you could mathematically prove this with any obstacle world being piecewise polygonal, is yes. You can always make from start to goal if you can sense where you are, sense whether you're in contact, because you essentially make a beeline towards your goal. And anytime you come in contact with obstacles, you have a choice. You traverse it left or traverse it right, and you have to decide at some point when to depart, when to leave this contact with this obstacle. And they sort of mathematically proved that you could always succeed. It was a question of then what are the bounds you can put on how bad can you be? What are the worst case performance bounds? And we actually compared to an Oracle version. So first of all, our reinforcement learning agents are rediscovering this phenomena without us coding that in. And if we compare to even a clairvoyant bug algorithm that takes the optimal decisions when it hits a target, if we tell it go left versus go right, so that's the only decision it has to make, even then the path efficiency of this bug, of this clairvoyant bug, would only be 46%. Our agents are actually more efficient than that. The success rates are similar, though not identical. Our agents don't always succeed, but they are far more efficient when they succeed. So the next obvious question is, well, how? Like, how are these agents doing it? So blind agents can navigate, but using what mechanism? And the only mechanism possible has to be memory, right? There's no other perception in there. So it has to be the memory in this LSTM recurrent policy. So we checked how much is it using its memory. So on the x-axis is if we clip its memory to a particular size. So if we allow it to build a memory of 1,000 steps, 100 steps, 10 steps, and 1 step, turns out that a memory-less agent that only knows its current location or maybe one past previous location, that gets to essentially 0. You cannot navigate that way. But what's interesting is that performance does not saturate till something like 1,000 steps. So you have to remember the past 1,000 steps in order to make sure you don't fall for things like forgetting that you've actually gone into a room and now you're coming back and you were headed some way. And this memory is used to detect collisions. So we find the emergence of collision detection neurons, if you will, where we can take the hidden state of this LSTM and predict whether this agent in the previous action had collided with its environment or not. Notice that this is a collision detection sensor that we could have programmed in, but we did not. The only thing it knows is how far is the goal. That's all. It does not know that it is in contact with the environment. But it turns out that if you project these to a low-dimensional embedding space, essentially these agents learn collision detection. There are 4 sort of clusters that form. One cluster corresponds to collision. So going straight with collision, going straight without collision, turning left, turning right are the 2 other clusters. And you can track this neuron as the agent is navigating in its world, and you can tell that's what the agent think has happened. It's moving straight and it did not collide versus moving straight and it did just collide, versus it thinks it just turned right versus it thinks it just turned left. And there are sort of 4 nice clusters in there. And you essentially have near perfect accuracy of predicting whether you had collided based on the memory of the agent. What else does the memory encode? So if you recall, I told you about this chimpanzee experiment. We'll try to do the same experiment for AI agents, except we can do ridiculous things that you can't do with biological organisms. So what we're going to do is we're going to take an agent, we're going to let it navigate from source to target. It's going to, take certain detours, go into certain rooms, make its way back. Then when it's done, we're going to take its final hidden state of the LSTM, its final memory of the environment. We're going to transplant that into a secondary agent. And this is a completely separate agent that only has access to the final memory of the first one. It has no parameter sharing or gradient sharing or anything else. And we're going to train the second agent to navigate. And this second agent is going to take shortcuts. It essentially cuts out excursions, it cuts out detours, and it takes shorter paths through this environment, almost as if it knew where it was going. And we see this happening. Here's an episode. This is the first agent, first time in this environment, going from source to target. Notice it, enters into a room, realizes it can't make its way to the goal, backtracks, and you'll see it ultimately make its way to the red square. And then after that, I'm going to, in the same video, show you what the second agent does with the memory of the first one. And here I'm doing target to source. We've done both experiments, target to source and source to target. And notice on the way back, it is far more efficient. It cuts across excursions. It did not go into this room on the way back. It did not go follow any other pathways. And it's not just because coming back is easier as a task. We've looked at metrics on that. It's essentially equally hard. In fact, if you look at the path efficiency of agents versus these probes that are making the secondary task, the probes are as efficient on the way back as a sighted agent would be. So essentially the memory of a blind agent of an environment is as valuable as having vision yourself and not having been in that environment. You essentially know what that environment consists of. Do these memories contain explicit maps? Turns out that yes, we can actually decode explicit maps. So you can take the final hidden state from this LSTM, and you can feed it into a decoder, and you could train it to predict the neighboring surroundings of the path that the agent took. And turns out, dark gray is free space, light gray is occupied. And this is not, again, there's a gradient stoppage here. So it's not that the agent was trained to predict maps. It's just we're training for navigation. We're freezing that agent and using its memory to predict maps. And turns out that that navigation capable agents are significantly better. Their memories are significantly better at being able to decode maps. So this is a histogram of all possible episodes in our data set, and the entire histogram shifts right. The means shift significantly right. There are, in some cases, fairly detailed maps that you can decode out. Okay, so what have we learned about blind navigation agents? We have learned that they can navigate exceptionally well. They succeed. They are not often efficient in their path, but they are typically not efficient in their path, but they succeed fairly with high probability. How? Well, they're remembering past 1,000 steps. They're using that memory to develop collision neurons and so on. And why? Because map-like representations enable shortcuts. What they are developing are map-like representations, and this memory supports that. There is, of course, limits to this memory. So I actually didn't tell you about this experiment, but it turns out that the memory is task specific. So the agent will actually forget excursions. And we can tell when we look at it, when we ask it to predict whether it had been at a certain location, it is more accurate along the straight line path than along excursions. And I'm happy to go into details of that if there's a question. But overall, I think there's compelling evidence here that blind navigation agents essentially learn to develop map-like representations in their memory. And for us, at least, that was a fascinating finding. Okay, with that, I'll stop. Thank you. How does it perform on dynamic environments? Excellent question. Blind agents, we don't know. We have not done experiments for blind agents in dynamic environments, but sighted agents, we have conducted those experiments in dynamic environments. So sighted agents trained in static, frozen scans of 3D spaces, and then evaluated zero shot on dynamic environments, both in simulation and in real world. So in simulation, we can put in 3D models of people and have them move around. And in the real world, of course, we deploy it on a robot and have people in those spaces. Turns out there's a few different things happening here. Depth-based policies generalize very well from sim to real, and people just essentially look like obstacles in depth maps, not depth maps, I mean depth sensors, and the agents learn to avoid people and collisions. And so it performs really well. But those are all answers about sighted agents, not blind agents. We have not conducted that experiment for blind agents. Okay, which common distance metrics were the most useful? I believe this question is asking about the reward function where we use distance to goal. Or it might be asking about path efficiency. Regardless, the distance that we use here is geodesic distance. So you compute the shortest path on the ground truth map of the environment that you have available in simulation, and you compute the length of the shortest path. And so that's the geodesic distance. You can do that in simulation because you actually do have ground truth maps. Again, the agent doesn't know that. It's only for evaluation. Okay. Jason's question, have you considered where language may interact with memory and mapping as part of these experiments? Fascinating question, Jason. So we are interested in language-based navigation. We have some works on that. And, there's the sort of machine learning generalist hammer view of it, which is I'm just going to encode language through a language model. I'm going to encode observations through a transformer, and I'm just going to do cross attention. I'm not even going to think about these problems. I think it's a worthy baseline that must be run. But I've been around enough roboticists to know that somehow the idea of spatio-semantic language grounded representation, so essentially a map in which language is aligned, seems to be a reasonable hypothesis to pursue as well. So I would hope that we develop methods for that, and we are looking into that. So not from my own group, but externally, there's a really nice paper on clip fields that people put out, where in XYZ space, you also have language aligned with visual encodings of the 3D world. That seems like an interesting direction. And finally, tongue-in-cheek, this being a computer vision meetup, what am I to think next for blind agents? Where may blind agents be guaranteed to fail? Yeah, I agree with you. It's, so the history of this project is that we first did navigation with sighted agents, and I asked my student to run a baseline where we turn the vision off, because in vision and language world, circa 6 years ago, it used to be standard that if you took the dirty secret of VQA models was that if you turned the vision off, the language part alone gave you a very strong baseline. And I wanted to make sure we weren't falling for that in navigation as well. So I asked my student to turn the vision off and see how well it could do. And it was just surprising that how well it did, and that got us started on the sequence of experiments. So, nobody's shipping a blind robot. That's not happening, because why would you? We have cameras. Blind agents fail where you think that they will fail. Their only sensing is ego motion, so they are hugging walls, and you wouldn't want that to happen in the real world. Vision is a very powerful sensor. I think this was a nice exercise. It let us ask questions, but I'm not really here proposing that this is how we should build robots.